In 1242, somewhere on the Kipchak steppe north of the Black Sea, a boy watched the Mongols kill his parents. Captured within hours, sold into slavery within weeks, he was transported by ship across the Black Sea and then overland through Anatolia into the Arab world, passing through the hands of at least 2 merchants before landing in a Damascus slave market. His first buyer paid 800 dirhams, a low price even then, and returned almost immediately because the defect in one of his eyes, a faint white spot forming at the edge of the iris, made him worth less than average. The merchant gave him back like a faulty piece of livestock, and the second buyer paid whatever the first would take. That boy had no birth name in the historical record. The sources don't preserve it, and no one thought to ask. One of his owners gave him the name Baybars, in his native Kipchak language, Great Panther, and whether his parents ever learned what he became, we have no way of knowing. What the record does show is this. The people who enslaved him were fleeing the Mongols. The people who bought him trained him to fight, and the people he eventually destroyed on a September morning in 1260 in a valley in southeastern Galilee were the Mongols themselves. This is the story nobody tells about why they were finally stopped. To understand Ain Jalut, you have to understand what the Mongols were by 1260, not just as a military force, but as a psychological one. For 40 years, they had consumed everything in their path. The Jin dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Khwarezmian Empire, civilization after civilization absorbed or erased until their very name had become a weapon that cities surrendered to before the first arrow was fired. Baghdad, the intellectual heart of the Islamic world, had fallen 2 years earlier. The shadow that fell on Baghdad fell next on Aleppo, and after Aleppo on Damascus, and by the spring of 1260, the Mongol general Kitbuka had pushed all the way to Gaza, with Egypt clearly in his sight. And then something happened that no one had predicted. Möngke Khan, the great Khan, ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, died fighting the Southern Song in China, and his death triggered a cascade that would change everything. Under Mongol custom, every prince had to return for the Kurultai, the council to select the new Khan, and you could not arrive without your army if you hoped to be taken seriously. Hulagu Khan, the man who had burned Baghdad and shattered the caliphate, took the bulk of his force and rode east, leaving roughly 10,000 men under Kitbuka's command. For the first time in 4 decades, the Mongol army in the west was a fraction of what it had been. And in Cairo, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz had a general who had spent his entire life waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Baybars had been watching the Mongols since childhood, studying them the way only someone shaped by their destruction could. Enslaved by people fleeing them, trained by people preparing to fight them, he had spent 6 years in exile across Syria, memorizing the terrain, the roads, the valleys where an army could vanish and reappear from an unexpected direction. When Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo carrying their demand for Egypt's surrender, Qutuz did not read it with fear. He read it as a man who had already decided what came next. The letter the envoys carried was one of the most terrifying diplomatic documents in medieval history, telling Qutuz that the Mongols were soldiers of God on earth, that they had purified the land of disorder, and that he should know what had happened to every city that refused, ending with the words, "Hurry to give us an answer before the flames of war are ignited and cast upon you." Qutuz's answer was to have the 4 envoys cut in half and mount their heads on the Bab Zuwayla gate of Cairo, then assemble his army and march north. What happened next was one of the strangest moments in the history of the Crusades. The Frankish lords at Acre, sworn enemies of Islam, still clinging to their last foothold in the Holy Land, watched the Mamluk army approach their territory and let them through. More than that, they sent supplies because the Crusaders had run the calculation and reached a conclusion that cut across 2 centuries of religious warfare. The Mongols were the bigger threat, and an enemy of your enemy is not your friend, but sometimes they are useful. And so the men who had fought Muslims for 200 years stood aside and watched an army of Muslims march past to fight a battle that would determine whether any of them survived the decade. September 3rd, 1260. The Jezreel Valley in southeastern Galilee, terrain Baybars had spent years memorizing, every ridge and hollow filed away against exactly this kind of mourning. While the bulk of the Mamluk force waited hidden in the surrounding hills, he rode out with a smaller detachment, visible, provocative, sized to look like something worth chasing, and waited for Kitbuka to make the decision he knew the Mongol general would make. Kitbuka took the bait. The feigned retreat was the Mongols' own signature tactic: draw the enemy forward, break their formation, then close from every side. And Baybars had studied it long enough to replicate it precisely, on ground he had chosen for the purpose. As the Mongol cavalry charged in pursuit, the hills came alive around them. The Mamluk army closed from three sides, not levied peasants, but the finest cavalry in the region, trained under the same brutal system that had produced Baybars himself, fighting in terrain that gave them every advantage. For a moment, the left flank cracked and the Mongols surged through the gap, nearly splitting the line in two, until Qutuz pulled off his helmet so every man on the field could see his face and rode forward shouting, "For Islam!" The line closed, the encirclement tightened. Kitbuka refused to flee. Surrounded, outnumbered, with his men falling around him, he kept fighting, because he had served Hulagu Khan his entire life and was not going to leave this field. When they finally brought him before Qutuz, he looked at the man who had stopped the unstoppable and said, "Do not pride yourself on this day. When Hulagu hears of my death, the ocean of his wrath will boil over. From Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt will quake with the hooves of Mongol horses." Qutuz had him beheaded. The merchant who first bought Baybars returned him because of a spot in his eye. 800 dirhams, refunded. Drop in the comments. What do you think that merchant felt when he heard the name Baybars 20 years later? The remnants of Kitbuka's army scattered into the hills, and Baybars hunted them. Some took shelter in a field of reeds near the valley floor, believing the dense growth would hide them long enough to escape. Baybars set the reeds on fire. September 3rd, 1260. The first time in 40 years, the Mongols had been stopped in a major engagement, not slowed or delayed, but stopped and driven from the field. The news moved through the Islamic world like a flood through a dry channel, because nobody had believed it was possible, until it happened. And then, on the ride home from the greatest victory of the age, Baybars killed his sultan. Qutuz had promised him Aleppo as a reward for Ain Jalut, then gave it to someone else, a decision that cost him everything. While the army rode south, Baybars approached Qutuz and asked casually for the gift of a captive Mongol girl. The Sultan agreed and reached out his hand. Baybars kissed it, and that kiss was the signal. The Mamluks fell on Qutuz from every side, and Baybars drove his sword into the Sultan's neck, because in the Mamluk system, power belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it, and Baybars had just proved beyond any possible argument that he was the strongest man alive. The man who had organized the first Mongol defeat in 40 years was dead in a Syrian field before his army reached Egypt, while the man who had actually won the battle rode into Cairo as the new sultan. 17 years followed. Baybars built a postal relay system that could carry news from Syria to Cairo in 4 days, faster than any enemy could move an army. Embedded informants in every court in the region, fortified every likely invasion route, and rebuilt the walls and supply chains that would let Egypt survive the next Mongol push, because the next push was always coming. Alongside this infrastructure of survival, he dismantled what remained of the Crusader states fortress by fortress, Caesarea, Asaf, Jaffa, Antioch, until the men who had held the Holy Land for 2 centuries had almost nothing left on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. He died in 1277, the cause disputed, somewhere between 49 and 54 years old. No one knows where he was born, and the sources don't record his original name. What happened at Ain Jalut was not that a great army defeated a small one. What happened was that a man enslaved by the people he eventually destroyed spent 30 years learning exactly what they were, how they moved, how they thought, which tactics they relied on, which terrain would turn their strengths against them, and used every piece of that knowledge on the one afternoon in 40 years when the numbers finally made it possible. Kitbuka was right that it wasn't over. Hulagu came back, and after Hulagu others came, and the Mongols kept coming for decades. But Baybars was ready every time, because readiness was the thing he had been building since the day a merchant in Damascus paid 800 dirhams for a boy with a flaw in his eye and decided he wasn't worth keeping. History turns on smaller things than that. The deeper we dig into the past, the more we understand the present. I'm ZoMbo, and there's always more to discover.